All right. So a little bit more about me and my background. As of, I think it's been almost a year or close to, I'm a research scholar here at the Ronin Institute. As of the past few months, I am the owner and director of a virtual small business, veteran research and education curation, otherwise known as the VetRec. I have a research assistant professor affiliation with the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I worked doing research administration for a veteran center for almost 4 years before I moved into the entrepreneurial space, doing what I'm doing now. And then most importantly, and probably relevant to this presentation and the work that I do, I'm a veteran of the Virginia Army National Guard. Excuse me. I do think it's relevant to share. So all of my research really focuses on and centers on veteran identity. Most of the work I do or sort of come to research with the premise that veteran identity is really at the core of many of the issues in the veteran community. So stuff like transition challenges, the veteran suicide phenomenon, which some background, the veteran suicide phenomenon has been like the #1 priority for the Department of Veterans Affairs for the past decade. It's been like an epidemic that's been happening in the community for 10 to 15 years. And so most of the research around like health research with veterans tends to lean towards solving the suicide phenomenon. So my work really focuses on identity and how identity really is at the core of most of these issues. Is how I come to my research. So today I'm going to share a bit about a book that I recently published that's about veteran identity, and then talk specifically about a theory or a model of veteran identity hierarchy that I developed in that text. So some background on the book. I published Rethinking, Reintegration, and Veteran Identity, A New Consciousness in February of this year with Palgrave Macmillan. The book is written as an autoethnography. So if you're not familiar with autoethnography, it is a critical qualitative research method where the researcher writes about experiences of the self, so that's the auto part, mixed with cultural insight taken from like belonging to a specific culture or group. So in my case, it's military veteran culture, mixed with existing research and literature, so the research and writing process. So my book essentially is me writing about my own lived experiences of joining the military, serving in the military, and then separating from the military with literature about military transitions, reintegration, the veteran suicide phenomenon, and psychosocial adjustment challenges sort of woven throughout my story. And the purpose of autoethnography is not to generalize research, but rather to give readers and give the audience data and story to live with, rather than sort of more sterile findings to think about, if that makes sense. So overall, the book covers topics from, as I mentioned, transitions, reintegration, the suicide phenomenon, and psychosocial adjustment challenges. But overall, the book really focuses on and argues for understanding the social implications of veteran identity and how that relates to all of these challenges that we see within veteran communities. There's 7 chapters in the book. For the sake of time, I won't explain each chapter. I'll just kind of touch on what each chapter is. The first chapter is solely narrative. So it's a really condensed version of my story of sort of coming to joining the military, sort of how that happens. My process of going through my initial entry training, so boot camp and my job training, serving in, and then my decision-making process around separating from the military and what that experience was like for me. The second chapter is essentially the literature review, focused specifically on reintegration, military transitions, and veteran suicides, all interrelated, or like the interrelationship between all of these as it relates to veteran identity. The third chapter is my theory and methods chapter. I use Victor Turner's concept of liminality as my main theoretical framework. I also draw from Gloria Anzaldua's concept of borderlands for some theory as well. But I come to veteran identity thinking of it as being between and betwixt. And being on the borderlands of different cultures, particularly the military and the civilian cultures and institutions. So I see identity, veteran identity, as this constant negotiation of being between these different spaces. And then for the method, I already mentioned I use autoethnography, but even more specifically, I use autoarchaeology in this text, which is using institutional artifacts to ground the research in certain cultural nuances or cultural findings. So it helps to highlight or illuminate certain cultural aspects of the community in which you're talking about. And then chapters 4, 5, and 6 are sort of my data chapters. So that's where I'm really using heavy narrative and story. I'm using my own institutional artifacts from my time in the military to explain things about veteran identity as they relate to military transitions, veteran suicides, and these psychosocial adjustment challenges. And then chapter 7 is really the bread and butter, which it should be, and it is the conclusion chapter, but it's also where I introduce this new model of veteran identity hierarchy that I developed. So this is the visual of the model. There are 7 propositions that I developed to help explain the model, but rather than like reading through all of them, I just wanted to kind of explain it for the sake of time again. First, how I came to develop this model. I started to notice, so I've done work in veteran spaces since I left the military in 2014. So I've worked in like community outreach in the nonprofit space with veteran communities. I worked with veteran spaces and centers in higher education for since 2014. And so I've noticed a pattern working with veterans and myself and in other veterans. And it's a tendency to qualify our military service. So I do this a lot myself. My own experience of military service doesn't fit into the dominant narrative. So my unit never deployed to war while I was serving in the National Guard. And post 9/11 era, the dominant narrative around military service is definitely related to war and more specifically combat experiences. So for me in particular, when I got out of the military, at first I didn't identify as a veteran at all. But even after I started to identify as a veteran, I would always qualify my service. So yeah, I served in the National Guard, but my unit never deployed. And I thought that was just something that I did. But then when I started interacting with other veterans, I noticed other veterans doing it too, particularly veterans that have deployed to war. Yeah, I deployed, but I was only in Kuwait. I didn't actually see combat. Even veterans that did see combat. Yeah, I saw combat in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it was only one tour. I didn't do 2 or 3 tours like, many other guys that I know. And then even them, yeah, I saw combat, I did several tours, but I wasn't injured. Or I know people who were killed in action. So I noticed this pattern, in my interactions, but also in some of the research I was doing. So in some surveys and interviews, some themes around qualifying service would show up without looking for it. So that was sort of the premise of developing this model. And then I drew from several other models related to, or theories related to veteran identity or transition, theories of adaptation and transition to develop the model. The whole premise of the model basically proposes that there's this invisible hierarchy of veteran identity that exists within the veteran community. In that your military experiences, which is the left part of the model, and your individual identity characteristics interrelate to determine where you're at on this hierarchy. And then where you're at on this hierarchy influences your own relationship to veteran identity, which then consequently influences how much support you might seek out, what type of veteran communities you might join, what resources you might avail yourself to. And something that we know in research now is that veterans who strongly identify with the veteran identity are less likely to experience suicide ideation. So that's important and that's relevant to this model because sort of the lower you are on the hierarchy, the less likely you are to really identify with the veteran, the more resistant you are, the more identity conflict that you're experiencing, the more likely you are to be susceptible to higher suicide ideation, more psychosocial adjustment challenges, etc. So on the left side of the model, we have military experiences. Well, let me back up first. The apex is our KIA, our killed in action Gold Star veterans. So that this is an actual term in the Department of Defense and the VA. We have Gold Star families. So these are people who have lost a loved one, lost somebody to combat in the military. This is really the apex, right? This is the Gold Star of veteran identity. And it's important, sort of the cultural piece behind it, to understand the conditioning and acculturation that sort of goes into joining the military. The military is a very collectivist institution. There's a quote by author and veteran advocate Sebastian Junger that says, "Who you are in the military depends entirely on your ability to surrender who you are." So let me say that again. Who you are in the military depends entirely on your ability to surrender who you are. So it's this selflessness, right? It's putting everybody else in country, freedom, military missions, whatnot, before individual needs and selfhood. So the apex is the ultimate surrendering of self, literally, right? So being killed in action. And then on the left, we have all these military experiences that sort of create this hierarchy of how much of the individual self really has been sacrificed or sort of given up in service to the military institution. At the top of the apex, or not the top, but closest to KIA, we have visually injured from combat. This is where you can literally see war on the body, right? So people that have experienced an amputation have a visible physical injury from war, right? So they're wearing war on their body, it's visible. Under this, we're gonna have, several combat tours, maybe people that were invisibly injured, so traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, military sexual trauma. There's a lot of invisible injuries, and those are much more prevalent with the post-9/11 generation than earlier generations. And then under that, never saw combat, maybe weren't active duty, a dishonorable or other than honorable discharge. So this list is not fully inclusive, but it gives you an idea of this sort of hierarchy, right, of different experiences that you can have in terms of how much of the self am I surrendering for the military institution? How close am I getting to that full surrendering of self, the apex? And then on the right, we have individual identity characteristics. If you know anything about the US military, you know that it has not always been the most inclusive organization, right? Particularly as it relates to gender, for example. So there was a ban on transgender service members. Women in particular have been barred from certain roles in the military, specifically combat roles. Up until 2016, the combat arms policy was lifted for women, and then in the years since, women have integrated more. But what's important about this is that not everybody has always had access to the roles on the left side of the model that would grant one access to a higher status on this hierarchy, right? So both of these things, the military experiences and your individual identity characteristics, interrelate to determine where you're going to be at on that hierarchy. And then where you're at on that hierarchy, again, influences your relationship with your veteranness. And your relationship with your veteranness impacts whether I'm going to join this veteran organization, I'm going to seek out services, whether I'm even eligible for services from the Department of Veterans Affairs, whether I'm going to go for a free dinner at Ruby Tuesdays on Veterans Day, whatever it is, but it influences my interactions, the way that I'm navigating that space of in-betweenness as a veteran. And then kind of the so what here. Why does this matter? Kind of to conclude it. So again, currently only certain types of military experiences qualify one for veteran status, and then consequently facilitates access, to benefits, particularly as it relates to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Veterans with a strong sense of veteran identity are less likely to exhibit suicide ideation. I argue that everyone who serves in the military falls short of the ultimate sacrifice. Everyone who survives military service falls short, right? So we've survived, we weren't killed in action. And then as a result, we experience some level of identity conflict. And that level of identity conflict, I believe, is mediated by what your military experiences were and what your individual identity characteristics are. And then that influences, what are the challenges? What are those psychosocial adjustment difficulties that we face when we leave the military institution? Veterans as a population, we experience mental health challenges more than non-veterans. So I talked about the suicide phenomenon, but also substance use disorders are higher in the veteran community. Levels of depression, anxiety, and PTSD rates, so post-traumatic stress disorder, are higher in veterans than in non-veterans. And then ultimately, the more we understand veteran identity, which I mentioned in the beginning, I come to all of this research with identity being at the core of what I see being the main issue in many of the challenges that veterans face. The more we understand it, the more we can create and implement policies and programs and services that are more inclusive, and that help to foster peace and resiliency in this population. All
right. Can you hear me? So I actually have learned the hard way that if I'm going to show a clip in one of these, to do it right away so I don't have to tinker with the audio. So I want to start back in 1932 and then fast forward and then jump around a little bit in time, and in true academic form, try to stuff way too much content, most likely into 15 minutes. I'll introduce myself along the way. I want to start with this clip, though, to center when the war on drugs really started, because we tend to, at least in the United States, think of it like 1980s, 1970s with Nixon, maybe it was re-upped and really started in the 90s. And there's a history that goes back actually farther than this clip, which is approximately 1932. It may actually have been the year before. But this is Harry Anslinger, the first person I know of who was part of the federal government to use the terminology of warfare.
This is Harry J. Anslinger, Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Oh, sorry. The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
Got to be an audio technician to work these things nowadays. So I always start my presentations with this hypothetical question. What would happen if we just legalized all drugs? And the reason it's hypothetical is because if you've lived anywhere in the so-called Western world for any amount of time, you probably feel like you know the answer to this. It would look something like this. We might all come out of our houses in a month or two and we feel safe and everybody's quit their jobs. We're all just like doing drugs all day and the world's just fallen to pieces, because who in their right mind would want to go to work if you could just do heroin all day? Now, what's weird is there's plenty of people that have been researching this for a long time, not just in the United States since our war on drugs began, but actually all the way back into the 1800s, when a lot of the substances I'm going to talk about today were basically fully legal and they weren't regulated, which was its own problem, but we'll get to that. Most people that research this believe that on the heels of regulation and legalization, we'll see a reduction in crime. We'll see a massive reduction in the amount of overdose deaths, which we'll talk about in a minute, but is an all-time high yet again this year. We'd see a reduction in addiction, which should boggle our minds right now. Like, wait, you said legalizing drugs? And perhaps most incredibly, we'd see a massive reduction, much like on the heels of prohibition in the United States for alcohol, on the consumption of what we consider the most potent of these drugs. Because something called the iron law of prohibition says whenever a substance is illegal, you better believe that the people smuggling it in are going to put the most potent form possible, because it's got to fit in a small space. You want to smuggle 10 kilograms if you can, not 5 kilograms. So then why are we still at war, right? All these researchers consistently come to the same conclusion. If we would ever regulate and legalize, we would see these massive improvements in our culture. And to really unpack this, I want to go back to the past, an Upton Sinclair quote that was in his political run for office that he lost. It's really hard to get somebody to understand what you're trying to explain to them when their salary and their livelihood depends very much on them not understanding it. So since that clip of Harry Anslinger that I started with in the 1930s, what was a very small department of government with a very small budget to reach out and to hire legitimate people working pride-worthy careers who are building identities and feeding their families has mushroom clouded. And as we'll see, it's now everywhere, from the courthouse to the jails to the rehab facilities to the places that bring people in to do different sorts of programming to help people using drugs, to the police departments across the country. And there's tons of people that are making their bread in respectable legal careers, managing what now amounts to the victims of the war on drugs, people who end up trapped in the system. So now I want to back up, actually fast forward, and start with what I do now before I actually back up and introduce myself. Because by now you're like, well, geez, dude, you're 3-4 minutes in. Who are you? This is just a shout out to put on your radar. It's the link I shared earlier. I'm part of a group of volunteers that work through the University of Colorado in Denver. And every year we publish prisoner poetry, art, prose, editorials. I work with a lot of the folks in prison to construct academic level work and publish that. And version 19 is getting ready to come out in probably about 6 months now. If you have people who are inside or people who work with people inside, valuable resource to share. But this is personal to me. So I not only help do this magazine, but I work for the University of Colorado. We're on our 3rd semester now of a pilot program teaching college courses, not special, we'll teach you to like weld or whatever, but actually the same curriculum that the people on campus get, which has been, as you might imagine, quite a trick for the last 18 months. But we're getting ready to take off on yet another semester, and the bolts haven't come flying out as of yet, and we're halfway to 45 students having what amounts to a bachelor's degree in communication, and hopefully at some point moving that on to the full associates and who knows, maybe even a master's. So this is why this is personal to me. Let's go back 15 years now and let me introduce myself. My name's Ben Boyce. This is where I was 15, 20 years ago. I was released from prison. I always have to do the math. It was almost 18 years ago. August 18th will be 18 years, actually. So this is what I was going through before. I don't have my chat up, so if people are talking to me, sorry. I'll have to open it on the other screen. If it's something big, just like interrupt me and let me know. I see there's a lot of chat stuff going on. This is where I was at. I was both a methadone user once I was released from prison, and as you can see, below that is my parole ID. This is the same pic they took of me on the way into prison, and I had to carry this thing around because I couldn't get a haircut before the pic for my whole prison sentence. So I was a drug user, an addicted person in the United States. I was actually mainline injecting cocaine and heroin. I had a pretty heavy addiction to benzodiazepines in the form of Xanax, fentanyl before it was the stuff you get on the street. I had a pretty steady connection on medical patches. And that was where I started with very little understanding of what drugs were, what they would do to me. I just knew because I grew up in the United States, when you use drugs, you go bananas and you commit all sorts of crimes and you'll never stop. You're going to give away your dog. You're going to quit everything valuable. And of course, I followed that narrative. So this is where we put people in the United States. And this is where I ended up. This is actually now a building in Jackson, Michigan that from time to time offers tours. It's called 7 Block. It's part of Jackson Prison, which is a bigger building. The government loves Pentagon-shaped buildings for some reason. I'll come back to this pic, but this is the bigger building. So the cell block I'm showing you, if you can see my cursor, is right here. The walls are so massive that the cell blocks are built into the walls all the way around. Plus, they've now built all these additional cell blocks, and there's actually some more out here nowadays. So this is where I started. This is where we put drug users in the United States. And it is every bit of Alcatraz style penitentiary. This isn't the nice, cozy place you see on Orange is the New Black. In fact, Alcatraz started housing federal inmates the same year that Jackson Prison opened. At the time, it was the largest walled prison on earth. In trivia, it still is, but because one person can't, here's some Foucault for you. One person in power cannot run an institution that big. It was full of corruption. There was all sorts of stuff going on 8 acres away where nobody would know. And they had to split the prison into smaller divisions, but they're all still operational. So if you're ever in Jackson, if it's open, I encourage you, go take a look at this. Just be snarky when you're in there because they're making a lot of money off it. So this is what it looks like. It's 5 stories high. It's 50 cells long, and every one of those cell blocks is the same size. I was pure luck, I guess, that I wound up in 7 Block because the other cell blocks are still open. 7 Block was condemned by the fire marshal because the doors were sticking and some of the plumbing was bad. And they said, you got to fix it or get these incarcerated folks out of here. And the state realized, maybe we could just use this for tours. So our benefit, right? There's some cool pictures online that I can manage to dig up. I went and took the tour about 4 years after I got out and talk about a wake-up call to go see my therapist. So sometimes good things come from that. This is actually a clip from Stone. So this cell block has made its way into the movies. There's been multiple films that since it was emptied, paid a pretty penny to come in there and shoot scenes. So if you're ever like curious to see some real life or some full-size movement footage, there's a couple other films. So here's what I'm getting at. I was an addicted person in the United States. I wound up in that place because that's where everybody in Michigan goes to prison, from an 8-time murderer to somebody that just did one thing wrong and made a mistake and they're in prison. It's quarantine. You go sit there for 30 to 90 days. They figure out what prison to send you to. So of the people that end up there, here's what I was arrested for. And you'll notice on this list, it's petty theft. It's at one point I had like an old antique pistol that got counted as a weapons charge. It was embezzlement. It was going into stores and sort of grabbing stuff and running. So larceny from an official business. What it never was drugs, which means that when I got classified in that big building I just showed you, what didn't go in my file anywhere was this is somebody that's made some mistakes based on drugs, because in the United States, the drugs I were buying was so expensive that by the time I got picked up, I usually didn't have any drugs left. In fact, that's why I was committing these crimes of desperation, that I often would walk away from a car with, $8 worth of bloody change, things like that, that were just, on hindsight, what's going on here? So this is what really got me interested upon my release and figuring out not only what was going on here and here, but what in the world made that beginning of life, me, right, take this path of all paths. And is the story true? Is it just that, well, you use drugs once, that's what happens? All right, so some statistics that I want to sort of weave through here. I know we're jumping back in time and then forward in time. This is right now. So in 2022, the United States is home to about 5% of the human beings on the planet, and we're home to almost 25% of the world's prisoners. And when you look specifically at the numbers, I mentioned overdose deaths, reported overdose deaths, because there's some discrepancy there, but we don't have time to talk about it today. We're at an all-time high yet again this year. The CDC is reporting 105,000 people overdosed and died from drugs last year in the United States. And in the meantime, we've got this massive prison population that all of us, unless we're in prison, are basically paying out of pocket for, because we believe that whoever is in that place, there's such a danger to the social order and to our safety, perhaps, it's worth our time to cough up $40,000 to $90,000 a year to make sure that we keep them put away safe. And when you look closely at the numbers, you'll note that at the federal level, it's about 47% of the people in prison are there for drug charges. The state level, this gets a little wonky because people like me show up. So it's about 25% are there for drugs. But if you look at the numbers of nonviolent crimes like I was there for, and a lot of the people I was locked up with were there for drugs. It just doesn't show in the paperwork. Upton Sinclair's quote that I started with is really hits home when you enter these spaces. And now, as a college professor who goes into the prisons and teaches, I'm seeing the same story reflected back at me. I'm seeing these people that have been locked up with all this talent that were for a long time convinced they didn't have that talent. They were the bad guys. They deserved what they were getting, figure out a way to weld. And now they're realizing, wait, this is not only doable, but this is fun. I'm learning. And this is where Jeni and I's research aligns a lot. Identity. The identity that we paste on somebody at different points in their life and the performances that are required to back that identity up are really powerful in ways that until recently, a lot of people have felt like it was woo-woo to really acknowledge, because it's hard to do this research without sounding like you're questioning masculinity or questioning other taken for granted systems. And quite often, that's what we should be doing. All right, so who's using all these drugs? Because if that many people are in prison, and again, hopefully all of you are thinking to yourselves, lots of people. We live in the United States. We have a long history with drugs. As we'll see in just a moment, it goes way back to before they were even illegal. But this is right now. We use more cocaine than any other country. In fact, we are basically responsible for what was the long tradition of chewing coca leaves, which have the active alkaloid for cocaine in them. being transferred into this more potent form, cocaine, which people don't seldom get anything like addicted to chewing coca leaves. But the potency piece that you have to pack this stuff into a powder because you got to hide it under a seat on a plane means that when we're using these drugs, they're far more potent than what we evolved alongside in nature. The United States use 80% of the Earth's opioids right now. 12% of us across the country are dependent on antidepressants of some sort, meaning you shouldn't quit taking them without talking to your doctor because you're going to notice some don't feel right today. Half of us, a full half, we stop drinking the caffeine tomorrow, we detox. Now, we don't think of that for some reasons that'll probably become clear in just a sec if we make it that far, as a drug, but it would have been a drug had the government had its way. And in fact, I don't think I'll make it this far today, but you're welcome to look up a case that was in 1916 that went all the way to the Supreme Court. That was U.S. versus Coca-Cola, 40 kegs and 80 bottles, I think, of Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola had moved away from the cocaine wine it originally was because the government was coming after that evil drug, alcohol. So Coca-Cola said, okay, let's pull that evil alcohol out. Let's put more cocaine in, mix it with some sugar water because cocaine is gross, and sell it as a temperance drink, an alternative to the government came after cocaine. So Coca-Cola once again remanufactured and found a new drug, caffeine. The government came after caffeine, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court. The only reason we're allowed to drink caffeine in a safe, unpotent form is because they settled on a maximum amount that has long since gone out the window with drinks like Red Bull. So again, we love those things in the United States. And if you've been watching the news, we're not just talking drugs that you stick in your body, but our behavior. We've long been a country that embraces the idea of freedom, of being able to do what I want, of don't tread on me, of all the tropes that go into the American identity, but seem to immediately be forgotten the second somebody starts talking about drugs, because that history since 1934 has been rewritten with media. So right now, here's where we're at. We tend to think of the split that has been really cemented in the last 10 to 15 years, whereby we split the bad users from the good users, the bad drug havers from the good drug havers. And this has been like our saving grace. We feel like all these people on the left, the Purdue people, they need to go to prison. The doctors that are prescribing too much, they need to go to prison. But we're not heartless. We realize the poor people that are taking drugs, they're just poor, addicted people. And it's too bad that this isn't true, because it might actually let us keep moving forward slowly at a regular pace. But my problem was that I was stealing, but much like most drug dealers, I was also using and at times selling drugs, because in the United States, all drug users are drug dealers. We cannot afford not to be unless we're incredibly wealthy. Pack of heroin, about a dose and a half for somebody that's using about one dose, $20 all day long. You're going to need another one in a couple hours. So you may as well assume $200 a day. You can have that's too much money. Who can come up with $200 a day after day? If you can save up and buy 100 doses at once, it isn't $2,000, and it isn't even half that. It's less than half that, and you're at 800. And anybody that's thinking, hey, that hustler in the back of my mind's like, well, why don't I just use for free? That's the logical answer here, right? And it gets even better if you can save up enough money, or if you know a dealer that will front you, give it to you ahead of time and let you bring the cash back. If you can get 1,000 doses and you got 20 friends that are using, that are going to buy it anyway, you've just snagged them for $2.50 each, and you can sell them for every bit of $20. You might have a place to stay next month. You might have something to eat tonight. The logical decision, and not just for drug users, often for people who need to pay their rent and see somebody day after day going in that apartment and buying something that they could run middleman for and make some money and feed their kids or pay their rent. We built a system where chemicals that cost about $1 a gram to produce, cocaine and heroin, are worth $300 to $500 on the streets of the United States. And that's a system that any capitalist culture is going to find themselves dealing with the flashback from that, because of course people are drawn to that market, and you can't enforce it by calling the police. You have to enforce it with violence. All right, so I'll rush through this real quick, but I do want to just, the point of today is to bring this together and say that right now, other countries are not doing what we're doing. And this is why I think we're going to see the war on drugs finally shift, and we'll see something like regulation and legalization in our lifetime. South America, cocaine is largely legalized. And in fact, in some areas, it's the cocaine base, which is the precursor to the powder we use in the United States. It's used to buy a loaf of bread or to buy a gallon of milk at the local store. They have a scale that's just sitting out. In Bolivia, it's legal and people still don't use it because they have this long culture of chewing the leaves. And once they legalized it, they realized culturally they disciplined themselves. They kind of gave the stink eye to the folks that were sniffing rails, but if you were chewing leaves, it was a little bit different. Canada, good Canada to the north. Now, I don't want to make Canada seem like brilliant or super empathetic because every doctor by far has not followed these criteria. But when the United States had COVID hit and we were suing Purdue and we were scaring the pants off of doctors to stop writing scripts as if that's going to make people stop using drugs, Canada federally issued guidelines that said, look, COVID's dangerous, and if people are going to be going out on the streets and risking their safety to buy polluted amphetamine and opioids and cocaine, and we know they will, write them prescriptions for these things and we'll figure it out. And some doctors did this, and they've seen, no surprise for those of us that study this, the patients that have now been taking regulated legal pharmaceutical drugs for the last 2.5 years are in a much better place than the patients that haven't been taking those and they've been out on the streets. They're still alive, for one thing. And there's a long history of this in England. Dr. John Marks is maybe the most well-known example, who wrote prescriptions for heroin, cocaine, and amphetamine. What got him shut down is 60 Minutes covered him, and it was just too much press. And he was putting cocaine in cigarettes, which rung the magic bell in us that was like, that sounds like crack, how dare you? But he found the same thing, that the people who were in his clinic getting their drugs from a pharmacy had much better quality of life. And he also recognized, perhaps the perfect capstone of today, that most people age out of addiction in about 10 years. People that find themselves really stuck in those bad places or those so-called rock bottom spots that we often think of, you got to get there so you can dry out or so you can force yourself to stop. If you can keep people who are struggling with addiction alive for 10 years, the vast majority of them, like me, just stop using problematically. So the trick often becomes, do you want people to die at the rate of 105,000 a year, or do you want to do whatever we got to do to keep folks alive?